The truth as opposed to the myth about outlaws in the Old West, the myths outweigh the truth by a mile.
The romantic image, and there's some truth to it, is that they were men who had been forced to do it by the effects of the Civil War and by the absolutely ruthless nature of big-time Western businesses.
It was never portrayed accurately in newspapers or in the pulp novels, and in reality, it was a desperate chase for life.
Many of the famous gunfighters had their start in the California Gold Rush, in the California gold fields, 1848, 1849. But in a way, the outlaw gangs got kick-started by the Civil War. Well, when the Civil War erupted, the partisans on either side became guerrilla warriors. Coming out of that guerrilla warfare were many outlaw gangs, especially from the Confederacy. The most famous of the gangs was the James Younger Gang.
It's with the James Younger Gang that the legend of the noble outlaw is reborn in the American West. Both the Youngers and the James had fought in the Civil War. They'd been part of guerrilla units, and for them, the war didn't end with the surrender of Lee at Appomattox. The war for these men never ended.
Many returning Confederate soldiers found they had no farms, their family properties had been confiscated, and many, like Jesse James, sought revenge against the Union through the railroads and through the banks.
Instead of just outlaws, they were fighters for the lost cause, the cause of the Southern Confederacy. They were now continuing to carry the battle to the hated Yankees in the form of banks and railroads.
So it was natural for people to identify with them. It was natural for people who loved the Confederacy to see these young men as their heroes.
There were certain targets that in the Old West, in the frontier society, were almost accepted as fair game. Well, the bank that had foreclosed on my farm, you hold up that bank, it's all right, boy.
They moved up from cattle rustling to stagecoach robbery and then ultimately into train robbery. Stagecoach robbery allowed them to use the terrain in which you can hide and still make your escape. Oftentimes they would attack stagecoaches at night, which made pursuit even more difficult. Black Bart in California, the most prolific stagecoach robber, he robbed all of his stagecoaches at night and never used a gun. He always used a stick. But the driver couldn't tell, so he gave up the strong box every time.
Surprisingly, in the early years, although the trains represented very lucrative targets, they had no security on board. And the outlaws knew this. These were well-defined missions and well-executed. The Daltons, for example, were a highly intelligent, able bunch. Grat Dalton had been a deputy marshal, and Bob Dalton also became deputy marshals. And the youngest, Emmett Dalton, he was deputized by his older brothers, and that was before they stepped over the line. They felt they had been wronged by the government. They weren't paid for a number of arrests, but they had been on the right side of the law. They could have done anything with their lives they wanted to.
Actually, the lawmen walked the very fine line between black and white, and it usually in a charcoal gray area.
Most of these lawmen were not the county sheriff, somebody local people had elected. These lawmen would be Wells Fargo detectives or Pinkerton's agents.
Pinkertons began during the Civil War as bodyguards, particularly for Abraham Lincoln. The Pinkertons were involved to try to both protect robberies from happening and then going after people who had robbed trains.
The Pinkertons are generally depicted as these romantic, resourceful, talented detectives. But they were a bunch of criminals, at least in their actions. The Pinkertons were absolutely ruthless in their attempts to track down wanted men. Few people know what was it that really aggravated Jesse James and Frank James. Well, the Civil War didn't help, but the bomb the Pinkertons threw into the James's home, that gave them a bone to pick.
They didn't happen to be there at that moment, but it exploded. It killed the James boys' little half-brother, Archie Samuels. It blew off their mother's arm. And of course, the headlines in newspapers of that day sided with the James boys. And so the James boys would never have done anything like this, pick on a child and an old woman.
In New Mexico and in Missouri, the James brothers had a wonderful network of support. Billy the Kid had a wonderful network of support. However, here in Arizona, there was a tremendous amount of public outcry against the Outlaws. They called themselves cowboys.
Many of them were 16, 17 years old. An old cowboy might have been in his mid to late 20s. This was a young man's game, and it was something you could do for a time. In your 20s, it was one thing to be on the run and live this life. In your 30s, it was another thing. Outlaws saw that their life probably would end in gunfire, and they'd probably die young.
Until Butch Cassidy, because he and the Sundance Kid were much more mobile, and they were always being pursued by lawmen, and that was a deadly life, and they all paid the price for that life.
Most of what we know as the gunfights in the Old West were between gunmen. They were professionals, and often they were hired by different factions of the town or the county. And sometimes they would fight each other in a classic one-on-one duel. Often this might be fueled by a night of drinking and gambling in a saloon and harsh words being exchanged.
9 out of 10 times, most gunfights were one-on-one, and usually they were so drunk they never hit each other. And then the reality would set in that they almost died. They'd go shake hands and start drinking again.
Usually, one man either had an advantage over the other, or the other guy was at a disadvantage from some other reason. Most people just waited in seclusion. Somebody came out and shot them before they knew what they were doing. In fact, if you look at the court cases, I'm always amazed at how many people shot unarmed people and got away with self-defense. Now, how can you shoot a man that's unarmed and say it's self-defense? It's pretty hard to do unless he's attacking you in some way. And this happened pretty often, particularly in Tombstone.
City Ordinance Number 9, which was passed and signed into law in 1880 before any Earp held any office here, forbids the carrying of firearms here in town.
The gunfight, the shootout at the OK Corral, you could almost call it the execution at the OK Corral. Very few people know that Ike Clanton and Tom McLaury were unarmed.
Virgil Earp was the city marshal. He went down there after deputizing his brothers to disarm the cowboys. Started out as 4 on 6. There were 6 of the Outlaws or affiliates of the Outlaws in the vacant lot, and the 3 Earps and Doc Holliday. 3 of the others ran away. That left 4 on 3. Virgil said, "Throw up your hands, boys, I want your guns," which sounds very simple.
At that moment, there's a clicking sound, and it's Doc Holliday cocking his double-barreled shotgun. Tom McLaury at the same time is throwing up in his coat and saying, "I'm unarmed." And Billy Clanton is throwing out his hands like, "We don't want to fight." And of course, Ike Clanton is unarmed. And whether it was simply an execution by Doc Holliday or out of the corner of his eye, he saw Billy Clanton's hands moving and he thought that was a gun coming up, and Tom McLaury opening up his coat and saying, "I'm unarmed," we don't know. But Doc Holliday let go of that shotgun and shot them both.
30 shots were fired in 30 seconds. 3 men were killed. And it made national headlines because the Outlaws here were causing a national sensation, not just a local sensation. And Wyatt was the only Earp brother that was never hit. He died at the age of 80 in 1929, and he was the only Earp brother that was never shot.
I think the greatest myth about the Old West is a quaking, frightened citizenry. That was not true at all. 2 good examples of how tough the average citizen in the Old West were: Northfield, Minnesota, and Coffeyville, Kansas.
The James Youngers have gone to Minnesota to settle old scores. They're hoping to hit a big, fat bank owned by Ben Butler. Butler was known as the Butcher. He'd run the occupation of New Orleans. He was a hated figure by Southerners in the Civil War. but he owned a major bank in Mankato in Minnesota. And that was the bank the James Younger gang targeted before their destruction. They find that the bank in Mankato is not going to work, so they shift their operation to a little farming town called Northfield. And they ride in, dressed in dusters, they walk into the bank, and they begin shooting. Now, they'd anticipated that they were going to be dealing with a bunch of what they would call squareheads, Scandinavian immigrants. But in fact, they were dealing with a little spunky Midwestern farming town. And when the guns start going off, the citizens start grabbing guns, and they begin filling the streets with lead. But they step out into the streets, and they're under a hail of gunfire. By the time they get out of town, most of them are wounded, and only Frank and Jesse get away. It's the end of the James Younger gang.
Those townsfolk were giving as good as they got. And who are they fighting? The best. Who could be better than the James boys, the Youngers? And the same thing happened in Coffeyville, Kansas. The Daltons came into Coffeyville with a couple of Confederates there, Bill Powers and Dick Broadwell, and they decided to rob two banks at the same time. And somebody discovered that the banks are being robbed, and when the Daltons and their Confederates tried to exit those banks, they were met with a hail of gunfire. Those were the conditions that left Grat Dalton and Bob Dalton and Dick Broadwell and Bill Powers dead. And most of them were shot dead just by the townsfolk. In the Old West, the average citizen could give as good as he got from outlaws.
I think the Old West in the United States is always going to hold a special place in our hearts. It was the frontier. It was the settling of a brand new land. It was a new beginning for everyone.
You know, loving the Old West and wanting to be part of it is part of being an American. Nobody could have grown up as I did without being greatly influenced by the tales of the mountain men, the miners, the Pony Express riders, the cowboys, the cattlemen, the gunfighters. All of this adds the kind of color, courage, reckless bravado that we love.